On a Saturday of huge games across the country, there's also one involving the ACC and the Big 12 as the Pitt Panthers at 2-0 go west to take on Oklahoma State. We bring in Jim Hammett from Cardiac Hill to help us break down this game. And, hey, the Panthers coming off a big win against Penn State. Possibly deserve a lot of applause, Jim, but that's not necessarily the clapping that's been discussed and bandied about between James Franklin and Pat Narduzzi.
Yeah, it was an exciting game this past weekend, but it's kind of even extended even after Pitt has won the game. There was a bit of a controversy in which James Franklin and the Penn State coaches were upset with how Pitt was signaling their defense. Apparently, the Pitt linebackers use a clapping method to tell the defensive lineman which way to go. And so, during the game, Franklin was complaining about it. Then after the game, he made mention of it. And it was kind of funny when they asked Narduzzi about it, he said, well, that's just another excuse. So it's kind of that playful banter. And, it was exciting to get that rivalry back underway. But, I think a new thing, a new age of the rivalry is this head-to-head James Franklin versus Pat Narduzzi. It's kind of been going on for a year now, and they kind of like to poke each other. So it's pretty funny, and it just adds another thing to the game.
Yeah, and the way at least I interpreted the approach of the two programs and the two teams and also the two coaches, because they set the tone leading into the game, was that Penn State was playing it down as just another game. This is on the schedule. Yeah, it's an in-state rivalry, but just kind of business as usual, while Pitt blew it up and said, hey, we're not going to ignore the fact that we want to beat Penn State. This is a big game. This used to be huge. We'd like to make it huge again. It's the first time in 16 years. We're bringing in Tony Dorsett and the rest of the 1976 National Championship team. We're going to get this place rocking and make it a home field advantage. And we're going to make something out of this because we do think this is a big deal. So the different approaches leading into the game as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Pat Narduzzi shut down the media. It was only him. He was the face of the program this week. The players weren't open to the media. I think that's an old trick he borrowed from Mark D'Antonio at Michigan State when they played Michigan. Kind of that same MO, like let's just focus and I'll put my neck on the line and we'll deal with it. So that was a big topic all week. With the media. The media they're never happy whenever you shut them out of a room. So if they weren't able to talk to James Conner or Jordan Whitehead, so that kind of upset them a little bit, but hey, it worked. You saw the game. Pitt opened up 28-7. They were ready to play, and it looked like Penn State players weren't ready to play. So maybe we'll see how they approach it next year whenever the two teams meet again.
Jim, I can't speak to the clapping being a factor for the Penn State offensive line being distracted or anything like that, Trace McSorley. But I know that once the ball was snapped, the Pitt defensive and offensive lines were doing a whole lot more pushing to the other side of the ball. That the offensive and defensive lines, the trench being determined and dominated much of the game by Pitt, seemed to be the determining factor for me, because for the better part of 3 quarters, Pitt definitely was the more physical team.
Yeah, it was definitely the Pitt offensive line. They really set the tone. They had a 341-yard rushing effort. James Conner had 100 yards. Quadri Olison, Darren Hall both had big games. Even Quadri Henderson on some jet sweeps from the wide receiver. It was really Pitt setting the tone up front offensively that really won them the game, jumped out to that big lead. Then also the defensive line. Of course, Penn State had some yards. They scored 39 points. Trace McSorley had a pretty nice game. But Pitt's defensive line came up with big plays. It was Juan Price having 2 forced fumbles, a couple sacks. Even Rory Blair and Shakir Soto came up with some big sacks. So while they didn't, and, even to an extent, they shut down Saquon Barkley. I know he had 5 touchdowns, but he never really got himself going like he could have, because he's a tremendous player. I was really concerned, but they held him to 80 yards. One of his bigger plays came on a pass. So, Pitt kind of controlled the tempo up front for sure.
That Penn State got back in the ball game, down 21 at one point. They get the touchdown before halftime. Then it really becomes a game in the second half. Actually, we're throwing the ball into the end zone to possibly win the game. That McSorley, not a veteran quarterback, time will tell as to his quality and whether he becomes a first-rate quarterback. But they got back into the game mostly because they did get some turnovers, but they started to make plays in the passing game. So is that concern stand in terms of facing an Oklahoma State team that obviously loves to throw the ball all over the field?
Yeah, definitely. Penn State changed their offense this year. They kind of went to a more spread offense with Joe Moorhead, the offensive coordinator. So you got a little taste of what they're going to go up against in Oklahoma State, but not even quite, because that Big 12, that's just the Wild West gunslinging type of football. And Pitt definitely had some breakdowns in the passing game. They kind of sat in a zone coverage a little bit, and Penn State kind of picked it apart. So even a sophomore like Trace McSorley in his second start, he was able to recognize some things. So I think Pitt's going to have to adjust a little bit more. They'll probably have to get out of their base defense and probably add in that extra defensive back throughout most of the game. So I'm interested to see how they approach it. But, Pat Narduzzi's calling card is defense. He was a one-time, one of probably the best defensive coordinator in the country. So I'm sure they're going to adjust, but it's definitely concerning because Penn State was able to pass the ball with relative ease.
Yeah, and typically Pitt has scheduled one big opponent, and the other three non-conference opponents have been decided underdogs this season. They've got two very quality opponents back-to-back, so it's not just a win against a quality team in Penn State. It's obviously a very emotional win because of how the game was built up, and then you got to go on the road, take on an Oklahoma State team that's going to have a bit of a chip on its shoulder based on what happened to them at the conclusion of the Central Michigan game. So the team's going to have to rise to the occasion.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of been the concern this week is they build the Penn State game so much to shut off the media, that kind of thing, like I mentioned earlier. So it's how can you capture that same emotion this week? But I don't think it'll be that big of a problem. You're going into a hostile road environment, national TV game, coming off a big win. So I think the team's going to be ready to go. But it's definitely, it's concerning because it has the makings of a letdown just, after beating your rival.
All right, Jim. So it's obviously going to be a difficult task going to Oklahoma State, second consecutive quality opponent on the road in the Big 12. They've got a chip on their shoulder concerning how they lost last week against Central Michigan, and you guys coming off a big high. Any guys that you've seen on the Pitt squad in the first 2 weeks, and specifically against a decent team like Penn State, that may have surprised you in regards to their impact, and we might look out for it in this nationally televised game against OSU?
Yeah, a guy I'm really starting to think that is, going to have a big impact in his career in this season is Quadri Henderson. You look at it, he's been such a weapon in the return game. Last week, they got him involved in some jet sweeps. He caught a touchdown. They're just finding different ways to get him the ball. And, I kind of look at him. He's a 5'8", 175-pound wide receiver. Kind of almost reminds me of like Tavon Austin a few years ago at West Virginia and how they try to use him. So I think his role is just going to expand. And, this week, Pitt's going to have to get the passing game going a little bit. It wasn't really in the game plan against Penn State. Nate Peterman only attempted 15 passes. Sometimes when you go in a Big 12 team and they get up a couple scores, you're going to have to throw the ball a little bit. So I look for Nathan Peterman to be looking for Quadri Henderson.
Yeah, Quadri Henderson, you mentioned the jet sweeps, 4 rushes for 58 yards against Penn State, and once the Panthers established the middle, that was pretty effective, especially in the first half against the Nittany Lions, 7 receptions, 82 yards, and a touchdown on the season. Pitt and Oklahoma State in Stillwater should be a good one, 3:30 Eastern time on Saturday. Jim Hammett from Cardiac Hill helping us set the stage. Thanks a lot, Jim.
Thanks.